So today we're going to be looking at the late MGB ignition, and the problem I believe we have with this car is actually a surprisingly common mistake. So what we have here is an 80 MGB LE, and this is a super low mileage example. And actually I may go ahead and do another video of just the car itself. But the customer tried to take it on a drive, and when he got off of the side roads and onto a back road where he could actually go more than 35 miles an hour, when he went to accelerate, it started stuttering and stumbling, and it didn't want to accelerate. And then after that, he noticed it seemed to run a little bit rough at idle, so he believed that he had an ignition problem and contacted me. So now we got it in here, and we're going to show you what I believe is the problem. So despite the fact that this thing has as low a mileage on it as it does, it has been desmogged and swapped to a Weber carburetor. Of course, you guys know, if you've been watching me, that I don't actually like those things, but that's what it's got. But at the same time that they did all of that, they swapped to a Pertronix inside the distributor and a Pertronix coil, which I don't know why they did that. He didn't tell me, because this year car would have came with a CEI ignition system, and those are dead reliable and rarely give any issues. These things here came from the factory with 6-volt coils on them. And this wire here is a 6-volt wire. But there's two of them coming up here. One of them is 6-volt because this wire here actually goes through the wiring harness all the way up by the headlight connection and comes all the way back. And it's a high resistance wire that is in itself the ballast resistor to cut the voltage down to the 6 volts for the coil. Where the other wire goes straight to the starter, and when you're cranking it over on the starter, it's putting 12 volts down that wire, or battery voltage, let's just say that, which will actually be somewhere around 10 to 11 volts while cranking, effectively overvolting the coil by a little bit to get better cold starts. Then when you go back to the run position, it goes back to 6 volts. Which is why some cars will die when you let off the starter, because you're not getting the 6 volts here. Okay, so since they replaced the coil, first thing I looked at is what is the ohm rating on the coil. They make 2 coils, 1.5 ohm and 3 ohm. This is a 3 ohm coil. 1 ohm is a 6-volt coil, 1 ohm is a 12-volt coil. But which is which? That can be difficult for the average consumer to suss out, because the information can be a bit sketchy. The way I like to do it, to remember it. If you want to remember which one's which, think of it this way. The one is 1.5 ohms. That is your 6-volt coil. The 3 ohm coil is 12 volts. Think of it as like it has its own built-in ballast resistor. That's why it's a higher resistor ohm rating. So this is a 12-volt coil hooked up to a 6-volt wire. So you're going to get a weak ignition spark, which is eventually going to foul plugs. I've seen this a number of times over the years. I've also seen where people do have a 1.5 ohm coil on here. It is a proper 6-volt, but then they look at this wire and they go, well, there's no ballast resistor. So they hook this to a resistor, then put that over to here, and then you end up with like 4 volts. And you get the exact same thing happening. And what this guy was actually worried about was this connection here. Whoever did the work, yeah, that's not as good as it should be. But the Pertronix requires a 12-volt source. That is a 12-volt source. Well, what we'll do here is we'll disconnect this, We'll take the wire off the drive resistor here, which is no longer needed because the original ignition system isn't there, and we'll hook this up to the coil, and now we have 12 volts going to the coil. Well, then we can take this and make a better connection by hooking this over here as well. Now, one reason why they didn't connect it here, other than the 6 volt, this being 12 volt and this being 6, is you do have this capacitor here. This is there as a noise filter, so you don't get ignition noise in the speakers of the radio. You have one of them on the coil, and there's one on the fuel pump. You could actually take that loose and hook this to there, because, you know, while it was a thing in the 70s, especially if you've had another radio installed, you're probably not going to see that here. As long as you have resistor plugs, you don't often get that anymore anyway. So I've seen this problem or series of those problems a number of times over the years, and what you end up with is just a weak spark. And one of the other things I don't like to see here is auto-like spark plugs. The most fouled plug I've seen in these cars is auto-lights. So I never run them. And I don't know a single mechanic that actually likes them. And the other thing I don't like to see in these is the Bosch Platinums. And I don't know why, but they just don't seem to run quite as nice on the Platinum plugs. Just stick with a nice basic copper plug. MGK is probably the most common plug. For years, I used AC Delco plugs of all things because they were about 2/3 the price, so I could charge my customers a little less money for their tune-ups, and they work just as well. I've had one plug foul in 20 years using those, but I have recently switched to NGKs because there's no more price difference. Actually, I can buy the NGKs for like 50 cents a piece cheaper now for some reason. So yeah, that's one of the common issues that we have on these things. So whenever you're putting a coil on, do your research. And the other issue sometimes is with these ignition systems I've seen before, the ignition system manufacturer will tell you what ohm coil they want you to use, but then they won't actually tell you whether it's a 6 or 12 volt coil, and you got to figure that out yourself. So there you go.